Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 98th episode of the Writ Podcast. Polls are pretty ubiquitous in campaigns today, but it wasn't always that way. So how did we get here in Canada in terms of our polling industry? Where did things start off? Well, joining me to discuss this today is Christopher Adams. Chris has worked in the polling industry before. He's now rector at St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba, where he is an adjunct professor in political studies, and he's actually working on a history of polling in Canada. So, Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Eric, I'm really pleased to be with you, and I've been a subscriber to the Writ since its very inception, so I'm really pleased now to be a guest on your podcast.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate that. So I wanted to have you on because you've always, you and I have interacted before, and you've been delving into the history of polling, and we've shared sometimes some very old-timey kind of polling data that we've discovered in newspapers and the like. So I wanted to chat to you about this. So why don't we start at the very, very beginning, before polling became really a thing in Canada. In the pre-polling world, for parties, for media, what did that look like? Would we see the same kind of horse race journalism that we see today?
We didn't see the same horse race journalism, but the way by which information was acquired was generally through, journalists being out there, getting a sense of what the lay of the land was. Watching rallies, political rallies were a great way for journalists and the media to sense, where is the campaign going, and also the political parties they'd sense. And one example is the, this is after polling came about in politics, but the Diefenbaker 1957 election, the polls weren't really capturing the surge in support for the Progressive Conservatives under Diefenbaker. But people were noting that the rallies were getting very, very strong. And in fact, the Gallup polls weren't really capturing this, but the media was capturing the fact that the rallies were really robust. And but in the end, people were really following the polls instead of the rally numbers. But when you look at American politics, it really is looking at the rallies, what people are saying on the street. But I think that we have to differentiate between party polling or the parties assessing where things are at, and the media. And there are really two different worlds. Sometimes they merge, but they're two different worlds. So if we look at the political parties, it's a sense of how are things going at the doors, how are the politicians feeling. Politicians would scout around to different people in their neighborhoods across the country, getting a sense of where things are at. And the parties also would follow what the media are saying, but then the media itself, it was often was based on anecdotal information. But the real change was when we look at the United States, they relied on a survey, the Literary Digest, which was kind of like the cross between a Saturday Night magazine or a general family magazine and Time magazine. If you think of the two things combined, Literary Digest had been doing polling or a survey of Americans going back to around the First World War, and they were basing themselves on approximately 1 million surveys, 2 million surveys, and they'd send out these cards out to their subscribers and anybody on any list that they could acquire, and they would do predictions. And in the 1936 election in the U.S., they mistakenly miscalled. They said Franklin Roosevelt would lose the election to Alf Langdon, and they based that on over $2 million surveys being done across the U.S. And that's a famous scenario in polling history, because George Gallup, as well as Elmo Roper and Archibald Crossley. These are three pollsters with different media clients. But Gallup's the most famous of the three, and Gallup had predicted, based on just thousands of surveys, that Franklin Roosevelt would win, not Alf Langdon. But so that's in the literature. Anybody talking about the history of polling talks about that famous battle between Gallup, the new scientific pollster, the use scientific was used at the time, versus Literary Digest. But what's not told often in the historical literature is that Literary Digest was really very, very accurate prior to 1936. That their non-scientific polls, but based on huge samples going back to the 19-teens, those were like within a few points of the outcome. But what made 1936 different was that George Gallup was doing representative sampling. It wasn't random sampling, but representative sampling based on quotas, whereas Literary Digest did not do that. And 1936 was different in that social class made a huge difference as to whether you're voting for Franklin Roosevelt, if you're lower class, because he was the New Deal president, or if you're voting Republican, which was Alf Langdon, and you would be upper middle class or upper class. So class, if you're higher class, you didn't like all these welfare policies, or if you're receiving. So anyway, sorry to go on but it's important because it's a lesson in sampling that you need representative sampling in political polling, because if you have certain people basing on social class, and Literary Digest was only capturing, because it was based on lists, the Republican voters. They was skewed to the Republican voters, so you had a misrepresentative sampling of the American public. So Gallup, 1936, that really is the introduction of modern polling. So
in a way, you can almost find
sorry, go ahead.
You can almost find a parallel between, when we see polls that are done on a website, on Twitter, on this kind of thing, that the samples are really huge. But it doesn't matter that the samples are so big, because it matters who you're sampling. If you can get that 1,000 sample that's representative, like Gallup was able to do almost 100 years ago, it can really make the difference between whether something's accurate or not.
That's right. Like you live or die by the quality of your sampling. And George Gallup talked about that in 1936. He co-wrote a book with Saul Ray. Saul Ray is the father of Bob Ray. Saul Ray was very influential in the early survey industry. He did his PhD in England. He came back he did what he called a scientific survey in the Oxford, I think it was Oxford region, but he did his PhD dissertation on that, came back to Canada, and he hooked up with George Gallup, but Saul Ray in the Canadian Civil Service was very influential. But yeah, so that whole Gallup world came up to Canada in 1941, and that was bringing in the newer world of polling to Canadians.
And how was that received when it came here? Because I've looked into the historical data to try to find the data sets, and it does, as you mentioned, go back to the early 1940s, and it does seem like Gallup was pretty much the only game in town. But how was that adopted here in Canada? Was there lots of skepticism? Was there lots of interest in it? Did it change the way that people were following campaigns?
Well, in the United States, it was the American Institute for Public Opinion, APO, and they parked their office. Gallup was a real brand manager for himself and marketing, so he parked himself across the street from Princeton University. So he'd have an address that had the cachet of Princeton University. So when he brought his operations up to Canada, and it wasn't just in Canada, around the world, the Gallup operations are happening in France, in Great Britain, and other countries. So in Canada, it wasn't the APO, it was the Canadian Institute for Public Opinion Research. So Gallup came under the word of, I don't know how to pronounce that acronym, but Canadian Institute for Public Opinion Research. And they had trouble getting into Canada. There was some blocking of it by immigration, and it needed the intercession of the Prime Minister and senior cabinet ministers to allow these people to come up and set up shop in Toronto. But they signed up a lot of clients right away. And Gallup's initial business in the United States was based on American newspapers, the most notable being the Washington Post. In Canada, he signed up a huge number of the Southam chain, and newspapers such as the Winnipeg Tribune here in Winnipeg, and anyway, different major newspapers across Canada, and those were his clients, and they would run every I think approximately a month. Every month they'd run an article written by Gallup, written by the Canadian Institute of Public Opinion Research on their recent polling numbers, and there'd be issues of Canadian concern, things on labor issues, things on war issues. There was the referendum for conscription in 1942, and that was their first major voter study that came out to the media, that is, predicting how Canadians would vote on conscription and not conscription. So 1941 is really a high watermark for the introduction of polling. But I should mention, Eric, that some people claim that that's when polling came to Canada, but really polling is part of marketing research. And marketing research is, a lot of survey work, and marketing research had been happening since the late 1890s. That is, people doing surveys on consumer products. Big advertising companies like J. Walter Thompson were in Canada in the 1920s, and other advertising firms were doing a lot of survey research. So the tools of marketing research, and George Gallup came out of the world of marketing research. He was a vice president with Young and Rubicam, an ad agency, for much of his career with Gallup. But anyway, the tools of marketing research were translated into the tools of public opinion research.
How did that exactly work? Were they mail surveys? Was it door to door? When did telephone polling become the way that polling was done in Canada? Well,
the bread and butter for a lot of consumer research was the mail-out survey. Maclean's magazine had a very large activity in marketing research, huge numbers of surveys, J. Walter Thompson as well, and as well as other ad agencies. So bread and butter was the mail-out survey, like Literary Digest did for their huge polls in the U.S., but the other one was door knocking. For public opinion research is door knocking. And George Gallup was really the perfectionist of that. He created quotas, and quotas, he'd have his team of interviewers recruited across the United States and across Canada. They'd be given quotas. I want so many white-collar people. I want so many women who are at home, so many people who are working in blue-collar jobs. And he'd piece together a quota sample that would represent what Canadian voters were, like what they were in essence. So to your question is what was polling done in Canada for political polling? So in the 1940s and onwards for a couple of decades was the door knocking. And the quota sampling was the door knocking. And then telephone polling, well, telephones didn't, the incidence of households with telephones during the 1940s was below 50%, and as we go through the 1950s, the chart goes way up, and by 1970 it's 100%, close to 100% incidence. Pretty well all households in areas except for remote indigenous communities and things like that, you didn't have them, but pretty well any household would have a landline telephone. And for marketing research, that they started using telephone polling in the 1930s for radio audience measurements, but for representative samples in political polling, it wasn't until the 1970s that it became an accepted way to assess where the Canadian electorate was.
So polling comes in, political polling, we'll say it that way, and being reported in the media in the 1940s. And if we look at some of those charts from back in around 1943 or so, this is when the CCF first moved ahead. There was a poll that I think was in 1943 that had the CCF leading the Liberals and the PCs. I imagine that must have been a bit of a watershed moment in terms of the impact of polling on discussion, because suddenly this party that never really seemed to be much of a threat suddenly is poised to potentially form a government, and would in Saskatchewan in 1944. So it feels like that must have been a moment when it changed a little bit people's perception of how to use these polls.
Well, I think it caused a lot of, it shook up a lot of people, including Mackenzie King. And in his memoirs, he writes about that the Liberal Party is really the party to stand beside the working man. That was the term used. Whereas the CCF, which was the predecessor to the NDP, the CCF, as you said, had that poll in 43 where they were leading the Liberal Party as well as the Progressive Conservative Party. But I think that didn't really shake up views about polling. Polling had been around for a couple of years, had been pretty well accepted. But the fact that the CCF had that one period in which they were leading represented what was happening in Canada. The Ontario CCF was surging at the time. I can't remember if it was just before that or just after it, but the Saskatchewan CCF was elected. They formed the government, which really shook up people. So the poll reflected, the National Gallup poll really reflected the reality of what politicians were looking at. So it didn't shake up perceptions about polling, but by that time people saw that polling was fairly accurate, but it did shake up a lot of people.
How did political parties then start to adopt polling and start to use it in their, making strategies, planning their election campaigns, using it in election campaigns? When did that become ubiquitous here in Canada?
And at that point, that's where newspaper or media coverage of polling diverges from the political parties. I've gone through like the archives, the National Archives folders on the Liberal National Federation, the Liberal Party, and the folders on their polling work, and they did, like all the parties did clippings. They did clippings of the Gallup polls, and those were the only polls at the time. It's hard to believe now when we see hundreds of polls each federal election now, but only Gallup was the only game in town back in the 40s. So you see clippings of that in the party folders, and others who've done research on this. Robinson's done a great book on this, the Measure of Democracy, but he went through other archives of the CCF, and he finds those clippings as well. But the first political polling that really happens is like Brooke Claxton, who was a very prominent cabinet minister under Mackenzie King. He oversaw much of the war for the federal government. Brooke Claxton in 1940, he did polling in his riding. So that's the first example I could see of a scientific poll being done in a riding by a politician. But as the 40s moves forward, the others start getting into the game, and the government, and this is before government polling, like the wartime polling, the war government, the Liberal government did a lot of wartime polling on what citizens were saying about rumors and things like that, and the federal government was putting questions on Gallup's omnibus survey, but also asking Gallup on the side, not George Gallup himself, but the Toronto office, to on the side do some other collecting of war rumors, and they would tabulate that separately, privately, for the Wartime Information Office. So there was government polling, but at the same time, because it's a Liberal government, they were asking that the polling being done, that they'd run the tabs with banners on voter preference, because the omnibus for Gallup always had that question: if an election were held today, I don't know what the wording is, but something to that, if a Dominion election were on, etc., who would you vote for? And the Liberal government, not the party, Liberal government cabinet ministers asked that there be banners for party preference on questions that were relating to wartime attitudes. So that was the merging of party politics with government, which would not be acceptable today. But so there was that going on, but also the first real party polling that I could find, and I'd be happy if someone could correct me on this, but the only party polling that I saw early on as a party was Liberal Party was polling in Ontario ridings. This is the federal Liberal Party, was polling in about 40-some ridings in Ontario in 1944. And they're looking to see whether to go for an election in 44. The election happened in 1945, and it re-elected Mackenzie King's Liberals. But 1944, they contracted with their advertising agency, a company called Cofield Brown. Cofield Brown was the ad agency for all the Liberal Party work, advertising for elections. Cofield Brown was commissioned by the Liberal Federation to do this Ontario things, and there'd be people riding cars with interviewers driving all across Ontario to these specific ridings that they saw were critical for the next federal election. And Cofield Brown used Canadian Facts for the fielding of this. And Canadian Facts had their drivers, and they had interviewers, and that was door knocking or intercept interviews in specific locations. And a number of reports were showing what each of the ridings, around 100 surveys in each riding. Some ridings were 200. But they had reports from Cofield Brown as what the Canadian Facts interviewers were uncovering.
I find that really fascinating, because we think about campaigns now and parties making their decision whether to go into an election or not as being poll focused and not necessarily based on issues, or it's just about identifying those few ridings that'll make the difference. But you're talking about an election that took place in 1945, and the Liberals are doing the same kind of calculations, pinpointing the ridings that they think are going to decide it and polling them to figure out if it's a good time to go to the polls or not.
Yeah. But the difference, though, was they're kind of like one-off things, and they would use sometimes to share with their candidates who are in the thing and to see, is this a swing riding, is it not? But around that same time, and I uncovered some communications with Canadian Facts to some others. There are some maritime Liberal parties doing polling using Canadian Facts, and Canadian Facts was one of the few companies that could do this sort of large-scale survey work of that level of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interviews. And Canadian Facts was the first standalone marketing research company in Canada. And there are others doing marketing research like ad agencies and in-house to Timothy Eaton or McLean Hunter, or Maclean's magazine. But the Canadian Facts was founded by, and we talk about women only more lately, the past number of decades, women being prominent, but it was a woman named Ethel Fulford. And in 1934, she had a company called Ethel Fulford Associates. And she had clients who wanted her to set up shop and to do radio research and telephone research and other types of marketing research. And it became renamed Canadian Facts. And there's just as a side story, Canadian Facts is still around. It's been bought out by an international firm, but Canadian Facts is the history of marketing research in Canada is really linked to Canadian Facts. And they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting of political polling later. But just one last comment on this, Eric, is that Margaret Atwood's book, one of her first novels, is called An Edible Woman. And that's, I think, her first novel written in the 1960s. And Margaret Atwood worked for a short while in her early days in marketing research. And I guess, I don't know if it was an interviewer or whatever, but she wasn't prominent in the industry. But she wrote The Edible Woman, which has periods in that book about working for Canadian Facts. It's not Canadian Facts called, but anyway, that's part of her experience as a marketing researcher in Canadian Facts.
That's really interesting. So that's really where things get started in terms of political polling. Over the next couple of decades, how long does it take before it isn't just the Gallup poll? Because, if you read any of the, histories of older elections, there'd just be that poll that comes out and it more or less changes the narrative of a campaign, and there's nothing else that comes out for the rest of it. Whereas now it's like a daily drumbeat of polls. But when did it shift from being just that one kind of poll that comes out every quarter or every month to multiple pollsters starting to release numbers?
Yeah, so Gallup, they did more polls during the federal elections, and you saw those happening, every couple of weeks you'd see a Gallup poll, and they always made sure to come out like a day or two before a federal election, and so you could look at the numbers. And then the day after, they would crow about how close they were, and often they were wrong about Quebec during the 1940s. They had to figure out the French issue, and finally, the late 40s, they went to Quebec interviewers and Quebec subsidiary to do their work. But where things really changed was Gallup was the only game in town until about I would say until the late 60s. There was one other pollster, Peter Regenstrief. Peter Regenstrief, who was in Canada. He worked for the Montreal Gazette, and he also did work for the Toronto Star. And he did release polls in the late 1950s, and he was the only one who predicted the surge of social credit in Quebec in the 1962 federal election. Everybody was floored by this big surge of Quebec seats to social credit, and a lot of that was pulling away the Diefenbaker seats that had been won in 58 with that massive landslide. But Peter Regenstrief picked it out, and he wrote about it before. So he was really the only other name that we saw out there. But his sampling was very, very different than Gallup. He did kind of a mixture of availability sampling, and he did some regular sampling, but he had a weird approach to sampling, which others didn't use in the polling industry. But when we started seeing more media polls, as we got to the late 60s, early 70s, when people like Canadian educated people started to arrive on the scene. And the most significant, I think, and I worked with Marty for a few years. My first polling work in marketing research was with Martin Goldfarb. But Martin Goldfarb had come out with an anthropology degree. I think it was University of Toronto, a master's degree in anthropology. And he worked in Paul Hellier's leadership campaign in the 1967-68 leadership campaign against Pierre Trudeau and others. But anyway, Paul Hellier had Keith Davey supporting him as well, and Martin Goldfarb hooked up with Keith Davey, and they sort of Goldfarb became the pollster for the Liberals in the 70s. But anyway, to your short question and my long-winded answer, There were few companies doing polling, public polling, until like the 70s, when we started seeing more Canadian educated pollsters on the scene. But there's a lot of marketing research being done, a lot of behind the scenes polling being done. But in terms of media polling, it wasn't until the 1970s that we started seeing a few more pollsters than Gallup.
You mentioned the Roosevelt and Langdon election, 1936. Another famous one that you still see today is the Dewey defeats Truman kind of poll that was done in the 48 election, I guess it would have been,
Truman,
where Truman was supposed to be defeated by the Republican candidate Dewey, and there was a newspaper that was already published showing that Dewey was defeating Truman because they wanted to get ahead of the press time because they were basing it on the polls. Obviously, we've had a few cases of the polls missing things in Canada in the last little while, but is there any cases going back further where there was a little bit of a faith in polling might have been shooken by one of these errors that we still talk about in the United States?
Yeah, and that famous photo of Dewey wins and Truman's at a whistle stop on a train, and he's holding that thing. And it wasn't the day after. Some people think it's the morning after that he's holding that, but it was some days after. But he's holding that. It's that iconic photograph of Dewey wins, and it's Truman holding that thing of the Chicago newspaper. Richard Worthland, who was Ronald Reagan's famous pollster, who many pollsters still model themselves on Richard Worthland, Dick Worthland. Alan Gregg of Decima Research was very influenced by Dick Worthland, but Worthland writes in his memoirs about Reagan as that photo of Dewey wins, he says, is seared in every pollster's mind about that, and that was a real learning experience for all of polling. And after the 1948 election, it was a watershed moment for American pollsters because all the pollsters had that wrong. It wasn't just the Chicago newspaper. And there was a major panel investigation done by major social scientists in the United States. And there's a book on this that pulls this together. In 1949, they released this work where they investigated what happened in polling in the United States. And what it came out was, the claim was there was quota sampling. And I was mentioning how Gallup did this representative sampling, sending interviewers out with quotas, get me so many of this, so many of that. And he had put together what Saul Ray and Gallup called a miniature electorate, right? That represented what America was. Same thing in Canada. But it fell apart in 48 because this quota sampling left too much to the interviewers to pick people out. It left out black voters, and the black voters in 48 were very concerned about Truman losing. So there are things happening in 48 that the quota sampling caused a problem, and the sampling was changed to probability sampling, what was called area sampling. It still wasn't telephone random sampling, but it was an area probability sample. So sorry to go off on this, but it's critically important for the polling's history. So in Canada, examples of where they got it wrong was it was the 1957 federal election, where everybody thought that Louis Saint Laurent, Uncle Louis, would win again for the Liberals. They had been in power since the 1930s. Nobody saw that Diefenbaker, this kind of renegade Tory, would be as the leader who would take the Progressive Conservatives to victory. People did see it in the rallies, but the polling numbers didn't have it. But the Maclean's magazine, when it came out after the election, had an editorial that once again Canadians have re-elected the Liberal Party to government for good or for bad, and it was miscalled. But it was I went through all of the Maclean's magazines. Shows you how exciting my life is. But I went through the microfilm at the research library, and I looked at all the Maclean's magazines for that election. They didn't have any polling done. They didn't have any references to polling in that Maclean's magazine. So it was just sort of miscalling it because everybody thought the Liberals would win. And when you look at what the Conservatives are saying, the Diefenbaker Conservatives, the Progressive Conservatives, on their campaign planes and buses and all that, none of the Progressive Conservatives predicted that they would win that election. So it was all around, it was a miscall, but nobody really blamed the polls. It was mostly, once again, they're still relying on anecdotal information, and it's not really till the 1960s that we see modern polling coming into Canada by the political parties.
We have also had a more recent example. If in the 2012 Alberta election, I believe there was a column in the Post or the next morning about how Danielle Smith and what it would mean that she was going to be the premier. So,
Yeah.
some things don't change.
I didn't know that. I know in your book, Eric, and I read your ebook from that you analyzed all the provincial elections at that time, and I know for British Columbia that was miscalled by many. We didn't have somebody printing the miscall, but the date. But at the same time, you pointed that every single poll in that last Christy Clark election had Christy Clark losing, and every provincial poll had the NDP winning throughout that campaign.
Yeah. So some things don't change in terms of accuracy, but on the whole, the polls have done pretty well. So we're okay. So if we're going a bit broader look, because we're talking about the sort of the competitive nature of polling starting to emerge in the 70s and 60s and 70s. How have things shifted then since the time when people were just starting to get into it? There was a couple polls that come out, not too many pollsters. Campaigns wouldn't be dominated by polls. How did things shift from that point in the 1970s to where we are today? I know it's half a century to cover, but the broad strokes of how that has shifted and why it shifted the way it did.
So I think a big shift, if we're talking about party polling, leaving aside the media polling, media-sponsored polling, the party polling, the major shift was the early 60s, and that was Lou Harris came in to help. Keith Davey was sent in by Walter Gordon to the United States, get me the best pollster. Lou Harris, who was JFK's pollster, Lou Harris came up to Canada in disguise, like he didn't wear a mustache or anything, but he came in with a false name, came into Canada, and he was cagey. Years later, he was cagey about how he got that false identification. But John F. Kennedy wanted Pearson to win. He hated Diefenbaker. So Lou Harris in the 62 election and 63 and then 65, Oliver Quayle took over, but he was part of the Lou Harris group. Lou Harris really was a change in party polling because he went out and looked at the imagery. He did like depth interviews. I think there were focus groups, but anyway, he did interviews with people to test the image of the leader. Like the Pearson had a bow tie, and he said go to the necktie because people are receiving that better. He found out that winning the Nobel Prize in the 1950s didn't count for a whole lot for Canadians. So it was the image building of the political leader. Lou Harris was really the first one to manage that. There had been some work by McKim and Alistair Grossart with Diefenbaker, but Diefenbaker, the pollster was being pulled along by Diefenbaker, not the other way around. But the Liberals really listened to Lou Harris, as did JFK. So that was a big change in imagery and things like that, and using data for managing a campaign. On the media side, where things really changed was the rise of the telephone interview, companies being able to do polling, and where we really saw a huge blooming of the number of polls was between 84 and 88. 84, we had maybe, I'm trying to remember, less than 20 national polls, probably about 8 or 9 national polls in the 88 federal election, and a bloom to dozens and dozens of polls in the 1988 election, in part because there are more companies on the scene. Like companies like Environics, you had Gallup, you had Goldfarb, you had, just to name a few, you also had a whole lot of research institutes that had been created in the 1960s, and I wrote this in a paper for a conference a while ago. But we had survey centers created in academic places, such as at McGill. We had Carleton University School of Journalism had a phone bank. The Population Center at Alberta. So in part, the merging of these university centers with the media wanting polling data, that worked well, that the journalism schools and others could then go to these phone banks and do surveys. So we start seeing these coming out in the 1980s more and more. So that had a change. And I think also with more companies, more individuals, more people educated on survey research. Like in the 1960s, we started seeing more of that. But now in Alberta, there are no people studying until the latter part of the 1950s. University of Alberta had no sociology students, right? Not to the late 50s. You see sociology as blooming in terms of numbers in the 60s. So in the 1970s and 80s, you have these people who've been educated at University of Toronto, at Carleton, and McGill, who knew how to do survey research. So suddenly you had a converging in the 1980s of educated individuals, trained individuals, more companies, more phone banks, and then that allowed for more media. But they're still like hugely expensive to do telephone surveys. My brother Paul, who was a national journalist back then with the CBC, he was part of a linkage of Environics, the Globe and Mail, and CBC. The three came together for the 1993 federal election, and the cost of doing these polls was like $500,000, right? And so you still had all these people who could do polling, but it was still hugely expensive. And the other thing too, Eric, that really facilitated a lot of this blooming of polls is database, data management, is going from the 1960s where almost nobody had access to mainframe computers. Canadian Fax was the first marketing research company that we know about that had a computer in the mid-60s. But when we get into the 70s, big companies have access. The Conservatives, through Alan Gregg, who went to Carleton University, would use the computing facilities there. But it really isn't until the 1980s where we have these desktop computers, right? I had a desktop computer at my graduate office at Carleton University. It was an IBM clone, and I could run SPSS off that. But that was the first time you had this database management in people's offices in the latter part of the 1980s. And that had a big impact on the plethora of polling that happened in the 90s.
So it became a little bit more accessible, a little bit easier to do the polling. You don't have to hire as many staffers to actually go and visit people. The telephone makes it a little bit easier to reach people. There was these relationships with the media, but then it all kind of changes once the internet comes along and IVR polling comes along. The price of the cost of doing polling just plummets, and there's a lot of outfits that do it now. The media no longer really has to pay for them. It's been a real shift over the last 20 years in the polling landscape, at least publicly. Privately, parties are still doing a lot of the same kind of stuff they did before because they have the money to do it. But publicly, the polling industry is so different from what it was just in the early 2000s.
Yeah, my good friend Scott Mackay, who I worked with at Probe Research some years ago, calls it drive-by polling, right? It's so cheap and it's easy to do for a lot of companies to get in. You look at how did Martin Goldfarb in 1974, how he did party polling, he and Keith Davey, and the Democrats in the U.S. flew them after the election down to the United States, to New York, to present to the Democratic Party how the Canadian Liberal Party was doing its polling. And give you an example of how difficult it was back in 74 is Goldfarb had hubs across Canada, and in place in these hubs were people doing their outbound phone calling, right? Because long-distance telephone was prohibitively expensive back in the 70s. It wasn't cheap until the later part of the 1990s. So he had people across Canada phoning within their regions, nightly tracking. He says it's 1,000 surveys he did a night. I can't believe that, but that's what he said to me a couple of times. 1,000 interviews a night, nightly tracking. They would pull together at the hubs they had filled out surveys, right? So they'd have these piles of surveys, put them on planes overnight to Toronto. And in Ontario, they had buses coming in. They'd be loaded on buses. They'd come in like late at night, early morning hours. In Toronto, they would then key punch these surveys, right? And then by midday, the following day, Marty would have his data tabs on where different regions of the country are going, and et cetera, his nightly tracking. So you think of the expense of that, right, compared to, these companies that do IVR, like Main Street Research or Forum Research, and they do credible polling for a lot of provincial-wide or federal elections. The riding-specific polling is often problematic, but I would say you have these IVR polling, which most of your audience would know about, interactive voice response. You can do 1,000 interviews in a night, 2,000 in a night, and the next day have your numbers. Like, it's astonishing what you can do, and then the online polling. But The first company to do IVR in Canada for election polling, and he was quite accurate, was Frank Graves with he'd kill me for that slip. For ECOS, he did like major polling in the 1988 federal election, and they were quality polls, and he was the only one doing that really in a major way in 1988. Now we see polling by IVR much more prevalent. And this is in a paper I presented at the World Association for Public Opinion Research in Dubai last November on how polling is changing in Canada. I have a chart, and if you look at the polling done in the final 5 days of all general elections, you see that the rise of IVR and online polling. But in the 2021 federal election, is online polling far outweighs in incidence. The number of polls far outweighs the IVR, and the IVR far outweighs the live telephone interviewing. Only one company of the final 5 days of the federal election, only one company did 100% live interview polling, and as you know, Eric, that would be Nick Nanos. Nick Nanos Research. Nanos is the only one doing 100% live telephone interviewing. Ipsos still uses it, but they combine the results into a poll. But it's a bygone age of doing this telephone polling, and it's very expensive. You got to pay. It's like telephone polling is like making garments in a factory, right? You've got piece material. How many garments can you produce per hour? You've got the machinery to run the field center. You need the employees to make each piece, right? And so telephone polling is like making garment. It's like garment work, and there's an overhead. There's employment. Whereas IVR and online polling far less because it's mostly automated.
Yeah, it's very hard to find someone who wants to pay for that, really. We saw in the Alberta election that Janet Brown Opinion Research had a poll that was done with telephones, but that was because it was commissioned by the CBC. All the other polls out were online or IVR, and probably the vast majority of them was self-published, which is something that I guess it does go back to those first days with the Gallup poll, where they'd even write their own articles.
Yeah, and it's a sign of the media not willing. Maybe they don't have the money anymore, but the media is not willing to put up the bucks. And when I did that review for the in 2017 of the Calgary polling fiasco over the Nenshi re-election, where Main Street had miscalled the election a couple of times during that campaign for Calgary Herald. Main Street wasn't being paid that I know of. But it was a media partnership. I know at Probe Research in Winnipeg does quarterly polling for the Winnipeg Free Press. They get paid for that, but it's not a huge amount of money. But the budgets for polling in Canada have never been great, but there have been times for some of the federal polling, like when I mentioned the Environics, CBC, Globe and Mail partnership, they did have the money, but those days are gone. And because of the plethora of polling, it's really you've got all these companies, and if this company is demanding money, there are a dozen other companies willing to step forward with free polling or cut rate polling. And I looked at those polls at the national level. Now I didn't go into the regional level, but the last few federal elections, the polling was pretty accurate. Like on the national basis, they're off by a couple of points. You mentioned Janet Brown's polling in Alberta. There are a number of other polls that came out in the previous few days of that campaign. Those were all within a couple of points of the outcome. So it wasn't just Janet Brown with her excellent polling and using telephone pollsters, but there are others using other modes, and those were pretty good. But the Alberta election beforehand, as you mentioned, they're off by, if you overall look at the accuracy, they're off by quite a bit on that last provincial election, and they're off the 2 elections ago in the Alberta campaigning.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating tour through the history of it because of how things have shifted. And, I guess the question is what's going to be next. It'll be more of the detachment, I guess, from between the media partnerships and the pollsters, whether we'll see new modes that are going to be starting to be used, AI kind of stuff that we're seeing, is being used more and more for other things. So the history of polling is still going to shift a lot over the next few decades. So Maybe a closing thought.
Sure.
Is the polling industry in a good spot right now compared to how it's been in the past?
Well, I would say, I mean, keep in mind the polling industry it lies on the bed of marketing research. And the marketing research industry, and I've written a paper, that paper I was mentioning about Dubai, and a paper I presented at the Canadian Political Science Association just last week, is the marketing research industry is pulling in close to $1 billion in Canada. And so the revenues are pretty good in the marketing research. A lot of people making money. A lot of companies are still Canadian. You look at the federal standing offer, that is the companies that sell marketing research for public opinion research, not political polling, but public opinion research and marketing research. They spend about close to $20 million a year on research of this type. Of the 19 companies on the standing offer for federal government work, 15 of the 19 are Canadian-owned companies. So I would say the marketing research industry is very healthy in Canada. And in terms of polling, the polling industry, like these companies are all involved, like anybody doing polling is part of the marketing research industry. So they're embedded in a very healthy thing. I would say one of the big changes that people are talking about, like the social media, the use of Twitter polling and things like that. Mark Pack, who's a British writer who's written a very good book called Polling Unpacked. Mark Pack came out with this book last year, and he analyzed. He said, the Twitter polling and all that is really not reliable. So I'm not sure how that'll go. And a lot of people are talking about big data. The Conservatives used Hanbury, their offshoot, but big data is used a lot. But that's not really polling. That's more for party identification and where to put your resources. So when people talk about big data, its effect on the polling industry, we have to see, because right now that's more for voter ID and for placing your resources. But the polling industry, as we see it, the modes of IVR online, I think that's the way things have gone over the past 5 years and will go for the foreseeable future.
So I could have continued talking about this for another hour or two.
Me too.
But so maybe we'll have to do it again another time. But Chris, I really appreciate it. This is really interesting, and I just love the stories of polling in the early days. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. It's a great podcast that you've been doing over the past while, and appreciate being your guest.